And so would you come and talk about why social science is important? And I think you've just heard why social science is important. Thanks, Laura. That was a fantastic talk. So I'll race through this really quickly. I'm going to kind of broaden out some of these perspectives. But when I'm talking about social sciences, law is a social science, economics is a social science, political science, sociology, elements of psychology, especially when you're looking at markets and business, behavioral economics. And then, of course, philosophy and ethics fall within the humanities. And what we bring to the table is a whole range of different kinds of methods, some of which you saw around more sort of qualitative methods or a blend of qualitative, quantitative methods. I also look at innovation systems, so I do a lot of work around bibliometrics and scientometrics. But the key question that is the thread that sort of runs through all of the work that I've done for the last 20 years, and I'm trying to give you a summary in 15 minutes or less, so bear with me, is how we develop safe, effective, and affordable precision diagnostics and therapies that are accessible and make meaningful differences in the lives of patients. And that just sort of basically distills it in a nutshell. And of course, it's a very complex question. So when we look at even small molecule drugs, part of the reason that they're so expensive is that the failure rate is extremely high. When you start off, 10,000 compounds through to one approved drug, really, really lengthy timelines. And fundamentally, what you're doing with that one drug that finally makes it through to the market is you're paying for all of the failures and the inefficiencies in the system along the way. So you really need to take a systems perspective when you're looking at innovations. And certainly in the spaces that you're looking at, where you're looking at cell or genomic therapeutics, the timelines are even longer and the science is even more complex and the failures are going to be even greater. So we're finally starting to see in the immunotherapy space, some very positive products actually making it to market. So this is, Carl June with CAR T development. But the problem is that drugs don't work if people can't afford them, right? You can deliver the best system in the world, but if you can't actually get it into patients at a cost that health systems and patients can afford, you've really wasted all of those resources along the way. The other thing that I always try to remember is that we always illustrate these things as if there's some kind of a coherent pipeline, that you start at place A and you land at place Z. And of course, that is not the fact. There are many failed stops and starts, iterative sort of processes along the way. And it's an incredibly networked system, right? It's very, very complex. So it's not a pipeline, it's a complex adaptive system of trying to bring things forward in the therapeutics and diagnostic space. Precision medicine just makes it even more difficult because you're shrinking your markets and you're making things more expensive pretty much by definition. And it's not just the science. When you're thinking about these systems, you have to involve people like me that think about law around business and around ethics and around regulatory processes. So that said, it is an exciting time. So I really enjoy working in this space because this is where the science is the coolest, in my humble opinion. And so this is just cellular immunotherapies as an exemplar. They're starting to make it through, not only through the sort of different clinical trial phases into more complex or larger trials, but also into markets, and of course mainly in the US. And the other piece that's really interesting from your perspective is that portion of the pie that is starting to look at allogeneic therapies, so things that you can actually start to develop as therapeutic drugs that are off the shelf, is an increasing piece of the pie. And the other thing that tells you about an indicator that gives you a sense of the maturation of a field is increased interest and investment and participation by the industrial sector, not just the academic sector. So, of course, when we think about things from a social science perspective, it's really important to put the public and patients at the center and first. And I know that those of you who are clinicians or clinical researchers, that is sort of just part of your DNA, right? Putting patients at the center of all of this. And so in this space, when we talk about working with asking patients what their perspectives are on precision medicine technologies, we can involve them and engage them in improving their experience in clinical trials. So actually doing studies not just on the outcomes of clinical trials, but actually on the patient experiences within the clinical trials and the outcomes that they would like to see from those clinical trials. We can look to see what does clinically meaningful outcomes mean. Like in Laura's talk, she was talking about, is it quality of life? Are we talking about quality adjusted life years, or is it purely an extension of life? So what do patients want when we're thinking about clinically meaningful outcomes? And then Laura was also talking a little bit about what do patients and publics want resource allocation decision makers to take into account. What is the value propositions that when you are making policies in contested spaces, we ought to be taking into account? So, and then of course, addressing issues of equity and access. So what do patients want to see with respect to the distribution of resources, for example, rural or underserved populations? So these are all of the ways that you can integrate or incorporate the patient perspective in your research. But in precision medicine in particular, so in genomic medicine and cell therapies, there are real dangers in getting ahead of the game and in overpromising. And if you know my colleague Tim Caulfield, he spent a lot of time talking about kind of what hype does in this space. In my own work with patients, one of the dangers in overpromising is actually being able to sit down with them and do a proper consent form where they consider risk. Because if you're working in a really hyped space, I was a co-lead on a gene therapy trial. It was the first non-cancer gene therapy trial at the University of Alberta. And it was so hyped in the media that, it was the cure for blindness, which it can't be, that when we were trying to develop the consent and the consenting forms for the patients, it was basically risk, la, 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 right? Like you just could not get through that there were significant risks in these trials. So we do have some responsibility in terms of thinking about the way that we mobilize knowledge in our fields and make sure that we at least stay within the bounds of the possible while still creating some excitement about the research that we're doing. Okay, so the other space that I work in, I work at the interface of regulation, reimbursement, and commercialization. That's kind of where I spend the most of my time. So this is going to be the 10-minute romp through. I can give an hour lecture on each of these things. In fact, I already have, if you're in part of the Academy of Translational Medicine, we just have a certificate course that's out on regulatory affairs and regulatory science. So this is just going to give you a very quick flavor of what we're thinking about. So in terms of the spaces that a lot of you are working with, whether you're doing sort of solid or liquid transplantation, and where you are increasingly turning some of those products into therapeutics through some form of genetic manipulation, the regulators sort of sit atop a variety of different parts of that, whether it's the manufacturing process, whether it's the devices that you're using, or whether it's the cell that has actually been turned into a therapeutic product. So it's a very, very complex regulatory space, and it's being there are attempts to simplify this. This is a busy slide, but it's if you're interested, these are the regulatory reforms that are under discussion to fundamentally bring Canada in line with other jurisdictions around advanced therapeutic products, which include cell and gene therapies. And fundamentally, what they're doing is creating this kind of space that's called a regulatory sandbox, where you can work with the regulators in bespoke settings to work out what package of regulations is going to be most effective for your particular product, particularly when it's something that the system hasn't really seen before, particularly if it's a combination, say, for example, at the biocide trial with diabetes, right, which is insulin secreting cells in a packet that is segregated or separated from the immune system. So these are things that are a combination cell product, manipulated cell product and device. And regulators are kind of struggling their way through what to do with these kinds of technologies. The other piece of this is because of the demand and the need, and the fact that the regulatory system, where you go from a small phase 1 clinical trial through to a large randomized controlled trial at phase 3, is very unlikely to work in a lot of these precision medicine kind of products, because they're usually often for rare diseases or fairly small patient populations. So you're never going to get to that large scale randomized controlled trial. And so what's occurring is that there's an increasing capacity with these regulatory reforms to put terms and conditions on the approval. So it's not a completely clean market authorization for these kinds of products. It is a release into the wild with terms and conditions to collect more data while it's in the wild. And so what that does from a policy perspective is it puts the onus on health systems to actually have the infrastructure in place to be able to feed these kinds of data back into the regulatory process in the long term. And simply in Canada, our systems aren't set up to do this. So it's going to take a lot of work for everybody to get through. So then when we're thinking about commercialization in these spaces, it's just as contested and just as complicated. So what we're seeing right now is that there's a bit of a kind of a land grab going on in the immunotherapy or in the sort of anything that you could think about it as being broadly defined as precision medicine space. So this is just some data around patents that are specific to CAR T. And you're kind of wondering, well, if to get a patent, you have to something that is new, something that is useful, and something that is non-obvious. How can you have so many patents in the same space? And part of that is a process issue with both expertise within patent offices and the sheer volume of patent application pressure and the amount of time that any individual patent examiner will spend looking at a patent. So right now, you're turning into a bit of what's called a patent thicket, right? It's very, very difficult to work out and navigate what is patent-free terrain. And so this causes all kinds of problems. It's a global issue. These are all of the different targets. You're talking about epitopes. So these are all of the different targets. You can see that the patenting for around different targets is in the same kind of space as where all the clinical trials are happening. Those are often things of just basically they're demonstrative of activity. You'll see most of the research funding and publications going into those areas as well. But what it makes this really difficult is for people to navigate, well, what can I do in my lab? Where is my freedom to operate if there's all of this, patent stuff going on in my area? So there is a thing called a safe harbor. I thought that was just a really cool picture. I really want to go to Newfoundland and see the iceberg alley while there's still icebergs. But anyway, it was very illustrative of, it's iceberg hell out there, and here we have our nice little safe harbor. If you are working on using a patented technology with the goal of submitting work to a regulator, you're in what's called a safe harbor. As soon as you go out into the market, that's when you're going to get slammed with a patent infringement suit. But it's not really a research exemption, but it is a safe harbor so long as you're working towards regulatory or market authorization. Okay, So with commercialization, one of the things that I like to try to get our thinking back to is that sort of original question, right? That original question of how do we develop things that are safe and affordable and aren't going to completely bankrupt the system. And commercialization and patenting is sort of one piece that can, because you're providing a protected monopoly, can, by absolute definition, drive up costs. But patents are also a mechanism to gain control. And so when you're thinking about working in a space like transplantation, you're working pretty much in a space where most of your work is going to be open source or in an open science paradigm. But a lot of you are going to start working into turning some of those cells into therapeutic or drug targets. And so you are going to start working in this commercialization space. One of the things that you can always think about is ingraining into your commercialization strategy these issues of social licensing and access. So you can think about cost differential, cost retention of rights, ability to use, or even think about differentiating your market between different settings, right? So commercialization you can use it to your advantage. It doesn't have to just be sort of a straight up money making venture. Again, with the increase in patents, this is becoming a really cluttered commercialization, licensing, cross-licensing IP space. And there's a lot of litigation that is starting to heat up in the area. So it is no longer benign. I am just going to skip that. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to talk about is just because you've commercialized a product, taken it through market authorization with the regulators, doesn't mean that you actually have a market. And so the final thing that you need to start thinking about, and it's never too early to start thinking about, is the market. And in a health system, and particularly in a public health system, that market is a weird place, right? It's not a regular market. And so there's this whole issue of decision-making about what resource allocation decision-making about what we as a public will fund versus not fund. And so health economists become involved at this stage of the game, sort of really thinking about what are the opportunity costs versus the benefits of implementing this new technology and adding it to the basket of things that we pay for. It's not a never, and it's the basket is a fixed size, right? Like, yes, we do keep adding to it a little bit, but at some point we're going to blow it up. And so you can't keep adding things. You have to also think about ways that you're going to withdraw things that either aren't working or obsolete, but if you keep adding kind of new technologies, you're going to blow the budget. And so the way health economists think about this is there's a slope on the line of a willingness to pay, which is generally considered from the perspective of a cost per quality adjusted life year. And if you're above the willingness to pay threshold, then your technology will not be funded. It will not be found to be cost effective. If you're below, it can potentially be funded. In Canada, no one will ever tell you what the willingness to pay threshold is. You basically reverse engineer it from decisions that have been made, knowing how much they've decided to pay for things. And in Canada, it's around about $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. So this is just the CAR-Ts that have come through in Canada. So you can see that some of them, even though they have received regulatory authorization from Health Canada, they have not received a positive market a positive reimbursement decision. And so even though they're allowed to market in Canada, no one's willing to pay for the technology. And so one of the things that we do when we work with developers is we do a health economic modeling using a type of economic modeling that's called value of information modeling, to start working at a very, very early stage to think about what are your main cost drivers such that you can work with your technology or develop your technology to bring it in underneath that threshold such that a health system payer will in fact cover your technology when you've finally gotten it through market authorization. So then tying that reimbursement piece back to the regulatory piece, I basically said that in the regulatory spaces with these really complex technologies, through decision points that aren't absolute, but that are conditional, and where further data needs to be collected to get that final authorization or all of the conditions cleared from a market authorization. What we're starting to see is an alignment in those types of processes between the regulatory system and the reimbursement system, such that we're working with systems now that you don't get a clear decision on whether to reimburse or not. You can get a reimbursement decision that is conditional also on the collection of the further evidence, with a clear exit ramp if the technology doesn't prove to be as effective as predicted. And so there's a lot of alignment and a lot of complexity when you start to layer on two different kinds of conditional approval processes, one of them at the regulatory space and one of them at the payer space. And that's the fun arena that I work with. So yeah, this was just an example of Strimvalis, which was a very expensive gene therapy that was approved in Europe, but it was conditionally approved for reimbursement on a kind of, there's a whole bunch of different kind of schemes for doing that. So, so the reason that I get excited about this and why I enjoy working in different arenas is because as technologies get more complex and push the envelope on our existing systems and structures, we need to have as much innovation in the policy space as we have in the technology space, or these things will never come to the market for the benefit of patients. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Tania. Any questions for Tania?
I have a question for Tania. Tania, we're cracking open the Globe and Mail and seeing the fight between our provinces for transfers from our federal government. And you've obviously brought up the most important issue, which is these exciting therapies are very, very costly. What's your perspective on how this country should go forward with national approaches as opposed to decentralized models? And how that might affect the uptake of these therapies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really complicated one and a politically charged one. And the reason I say that is because we are a very small market, and so there's a range of different policy reform options that have been put in. For example, with the reforms around the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board. That haven't really gone anywhere because you get industry pushback every time you have some of this thinking. In terms of putting together structures where we can negotiate on price, we have to work together, and there are systems in play to be able to do that. But each province has the possibility and the opportunity to opt in or opt out when a decision or a recommendation has been made, and to opt in or opt out of the negotiation process. If we're going to start thinking about these much more bespoke kind of arrangements, so they're called managed access agreements, where you are creating an opportunity for a product to be marketed and paid for, but under extremely stringent conditions, with a specified off-ramp if the health benefits are not achieved, then we're going to be in a much stronger position to be able to negotiate those kinds of agreements if we do it as with some unification, right? As opposed to each province trying to do it on its own. Unfortunately, with our constitutional federated division of powers, it's very difficult. So the best way to do it would be to have kind of a national agency with a delegation of authority or a delegation of power from the provinces. But those things are really, really hard to negotiate. And I could give a whole other talk on the data collection side and our ability to share data and do anything meaningful with it. So yeah, the constitutional framers in 1867 did not do this country any favors by splitting the jurisdiction for health.
Great answer. I mean, I think that's all the reason for us to be engaged in our current debate of the future of healthcare, because these are really challenging questions. Any other questions for Tania? Chris.
Hi, Chris Blosser. I'm from the University of Washington in Seattle. So I have a different governmental governance kind of perspective in this, but I'm very interested in your point about needing innovation in policy. And I'm wondering who you see participating in that innovation, as we've discussed, provider, patient, and others, including your expertise.
Yeah, basically everybody in the laundry list of everybody that needs to be involved. The other thing I would say is that in some of these arenas, the US, even though it has this weird and wonderful non-healthcare system, healthcare system, it actually has some shining lights as examples. So, you know, in this space, some of the most interesting policy advances have actually been with payers like Kaiser Permanente, the Veterans Affairs, so the VA system. You know, they've done some really creative things. CMS does some strange things, but of course they're not allowed to talk about the fact that they do some form of cost effectiveness analysis around quality adjusted life years. And we always scratch our heads when, you know, it's taken 30 years for Congress to finally say that on these 5 drugs you can negotiate, you know, CMS can negotiate price. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I think there are some policy reforms that are going on in the not-for-profit payers, some of the government payers, and probably some of the more cost-conscious private payers in the U.S. And you know, so that these are live debates in the U.S. as well. Does that answer your question, or not really?
It's an ongoing discussion, isn't it?
Yeah.
If there's no further questions, I guess we'll formally close day one. I know